So, Blood Meridian. Due to the sadly recent passing of its author and the relatively new announcement that another film adaptation is in the works, this text has received renewed interest in the last year or so. This is wonderful, as anything that can get people asking questions about literature in general is something we should be excited about. However, along with this interest, we must also bring a modicum of caution when researching what makes this story so great among modern texts. Unfortunately, whenever a story becomes popular in the mainstream, its more complex topics often get softened by shallow observation. This is especially true about Blood Meridian, and particularly vivid in regards to its most confusing character, the Judge. When studying Blood Meridian as a piece of literature, there are many avenues we could pursue. For convenience, here are some topics you can research on your own if you would like to thoroughly dive deep into this text. It will reward you if you do. But this video is about one thing and one thing only: the Judge, and how a better understanding of this character in particular can give us a much easier time digesting the book in general. Many people, after reading Blood Meridian for the first time, are tempted to research the Judge and his strange speeches alone, often leading them to this video. Now, we are not in the business of discrediting other creators, and this video and others like it are fine on their own. But to say that they grasp what makes the Judge such an effective and horrifying character, and effectively communicate it to the audience, would be inaccurate, and the conclusions they reach allude to a stark lack of research. Now, there are some incredibly well done videos on YouTube. These two are particularly well researched and thorough, and I urge you to check them out after this video, if you are interested. They will be in the description. There is, in fact, established literature on McCarthy's work, interestingly published only 8 years after Blood Meridian's first release. For reference, I will be using two main sources: the essay Gravers False and True, Blood Meridian as a Gnostic Tragedy, published in 1993 by Leo Dougherty, and the later work Striking the Fire Out of the Rock by Petra Mundik. This being said, even the idea that there can be established literature on a text, especially one so recent as Blood Meridian, is a questionable claim. Dougherty and Mundik's analyses are thorough, but also segregated and enshrouded in the history of American literature. McCarthy, like all great authors, has refused to comment definitively on his novels, and this means that even though scholars believe they have found and communicated the threads of influence that make up these dense texts, their essays are, by nature, rhetorical, and as prone to bias as any argumentative essay. Saying that Gnostic ideas, or even Gnostic feelings, are present in Blood Meridian is certainly true, but saying that McCarthy is a Gnostic, or even that he understood the Gnostic symbols he included, is far from certain. Ideas influence people, regardless of their complete understanding of them, and the depth of McCarthy's understanding of Gnostic history and philosophy will never be known, and that's okay. In my opinion, Dougherty's article is deeply connected to history and religious theory, but its analysis is a bit short-sighted and narrow. Mundik's is excellently written and contains some of the best text-to-explanation correspondences in the medium, but her analysis is also very connected to Dougherty's and shares its blinding aspects. And of course, you should view this video just as speculative and rhetorical as you do the others. In the end, McCarthy wished for the books to speak for themselves, and due to his death earlier this year, that will remain true. Such is the beauty of literature that will outlive us. So, let's get started. Firstly, it's necessary to realize just how incredible of a text Blood Meridian is at face value before diving into its titanic character. We, as readers, positively stagger under the weight of McCarthy's prose. I have fallen into the habit of describing his special technique as brutalist after the architectural style, and I think that name works well. The vivid and almost punctuationless style is truly a thing to behold. It was a lone tree, burning on the desert, a heraldic tree that the passing storm had left afire. The solitary pilgrim drawn up before it had traveled far to be here, and he knelt in the hot sand and held his numbed hands out, while all about in that circle attended companies of lesser auxiliaries, routed forth into the inordinate day, small owls that crouched silently and stood from foot to foot, and tarantulas, and salpugas, and vine-groons, and the vicious mygale spiders, and bearded lizards with mouths black as a chow-dog's, deadly to man, and the little desert basilisks that jet blood from their eyes, and the small sand vipers like seemly gods, silent, and the same in Jeddah in Babylon. A constellation of ignited eyes that edged the ring of light, all bound in a precarious truce before this torch whose brightness had set back the stars in their sockets. The flames sawed in the wind, and the embers paled and deepened and paled and deepened, like the blood beat of some living thing, eviscerate upon the ground before them, and they watched the fire, which does contain within it something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it, and are divided from their origins, and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, and the first fire and the last, ever to be. The sun, when it rose, caught the moon in the west so that they lay opposed to each other across the earth, the sun white-hot and the moon a pale replica, as if they were the ends of a common bore, beyond whose terminals burned worlds past all reckoning. As the Romantic era of the poets blossomed in England in the early 1800s, another style evolved alongside it, the Gothic style of Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and Mary Shelley. But as these styles crossed the Atlantic, an even newer, American Gothic was born. Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, was among these American icons, along with writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and my personal favorite, William Faulkner. Along with the foreboding settings, the cutting, razor-sharp edges of the black Western world, there was also an almost poetic elevation of the prosaic form. Literature became titanic, biblical in its reference and proportion, and these styles that gave us the devilish white whale of Moby Dick, the horrifying yellow wallpaper of Gilman's short stories, and the rotting lineage of Faulkner's Compson family in The Sound and the Fury, also gave us the Judge. He stood 6'6" in his moccasins, had a large, fleshy frame, a dull, tallow-colored face, destitute of hair and all expression, always cool and collected. The basis of Dougherty's original essay in 1993 was the acknowledgement that McCarthy had slipped a Gnostic philosophy under the nose of the readers of his masterpiece. Without us realizing it, the cosmology of Blood Meridian was not created from thin air. This is a testament to just how well McCarthy understood the authors he took reference from, and it also gives us a glimpse at his inventive genius. Many of the American Gothic stories that arose around the 1800s are heavily influenced by the Bible. This is something it inherited from the Romantics, but Gothic literature seemed to flip it on its head. Instead of portraying pastoral views of warm summer days and equating these peaceful hours to basking in God's grace, the Gothic writers would delve into the depths of the evils humans could perform. The devil became a fascinating figure, and the demonic influence that held sway over our tiny human lives became characters that their readers would lie awake at night, remembering. McCarthy, however, takes this one step further. You see, shortly after the birth of Christianity, as it slowly morphed its way out of the Judaism that precluded it, many kinds of Christianity also blossomed. Among these was Gnosticism. A complete explanation of the Gnostic philosophy is probably outside of the ability of even the most accomplished YouTube scholars. We know of the religion's existence because of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, but even this veritable treasure trove of knowledge contains many conflicting beliefs and ideas. Mundick, following Dougherty, asserts that McCarthy most likely takes reference from a later iteration of Gnosticism called Manichaean Gnosticism, and her arguments run thusly. Blood Meridian is absolutely replete with Gnostic symbols and concepts, one of the more obscure references being the depiction of Glanton's gang sleeping with their alien hearts beating in the sand like pilgrims exhausted upon the face of the planet Anareta. Dougherty, with the aid of the Oxford English Dictionary, interprets the reference to Anareta in the following way. Anareta was believed in the Renaissance to be the planet which destroys life. The implication is clearly that our own Earth is anaretic. McCarthy's evocative descriptions of malevolent landscapes, in which death seems the most prevalent feature, can thus be read as Gnostic portrayals of a nightmarish, anaretic world. According to Christopher Douglas, McCarthy uses the desolate, hostile landscapes of Blood Meridian to question the nature of the god that created such places. Along with this, Mundik also makes reference to an epigraph before one of Blood Meridian's chapters. The word Ogdoad is used, which is a reference to the Gnostic philosophy of 8 heavens, the 8th one being the celestial dawn, the one above all. And in the story, this is represented physically by a pile of 8 skulls. Notably, Holden, the judge, removes the 8th one and destroys it, symbolizing Gnostically a denial of the 8th heaven. And this is where we can start talking about the judge. You see, Gnosticism at its heart is a kind of theodicy, or an answer to the problem of evil. How could an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good creator make a world so horrid, so naturally evil? The Gnostics would reply, whoever said Yahweh was all 3 of those things? No, to a Gnostic Christian, the God of Abraham, the God of the Old Testament, is something opposed to human salvation. The idea is that humans contain a spark, a pneuma, that is a part of the alien God, the one higher than Yahweh. And the gnosis that the Gnostics seek is the knowledge of how to return that spark to the great light, the higher, deaf God of the true cosmos. Instead of wanting us to attain the knowledge that there exists a greater God than he, the demiurge, Yahweh, wants to hide that from us for our entire lives, and he employs specific tools to keep us inside his influence. This is a fascinating interpretation of Abraham's jealous God, of the callous and vicious deity of the sons of Jacob and the followers of Moses. But it does solve the problem, doesn't it? Albeit in a rather scary way. Now, these tools of the demiurge, what do I mean by tools? It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask man what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. War is God. The judge is a horrifying man. With completely colorless skin and a hairless physique, he towers over the men around him. He speaks many languages. He knows laws and statutes by heart. He never seems to age. He never sleeps. All of these characteristics are meant to instill within us, the readers, that something is different about him, and the fact that this character has become as iconic as he has is proof that it worked. We see the judge, we read about the crimes he commits, the children and women he assaults and murders, the people he scalps, and we are drawn in by that inhuman power. This feeling that he is more than a man becomes pervasive, and we quickly start thinking that he is something above us. This is all captured in the eponymous name of the character, the Judge, a title that McCarthy teases us with when we first learn about him. Tobin, the ex-priest in Glanton's gang, tells the story's main character, the kid, about the many strange things he's learned about the Judge. Then, about the meridian of that day, we come upon the Judge on his rock there, in the wilderness, by this single self. Aye, and there was no rock, just the one. Irving said he'd brung it with him. And there he sets, no horse, just him and his legs crossed, smilin' as we rode up, like he'd been expecting us. He didn't even have a canteen. You couldn't tell where he'd come from. On this passage, Mundik writes, "It is clear that the judge is no mortal. How could an ordinary human being survive in the wilderness without a horse, water, or shelter? Like the devil in fairy tales, the judge appears just in time to strike a bargain with the desperate gang, saving their lives in exchange for the allegiance by leading them to the rim of a volcano, where he transmutes a devil's batter, composed of sulfur, charcoal, bat guano, and urine, into some needed gunpowder. However, no pact with the devil comes without some heavy price, and indeed there exists a kind of Faustian bargain between the judge and Glanton's gang. Similarly, Sepik argues that Holden's gift of gunpowder has overtones of Mephistopheles' gift to Faust, and incorporates an entire series of arcane, theological, and historical issues. Within the novel itself, Tobin hints that there is a secret commerce, some terrible covenant, between Glanton and the judge. When the kid tells Tobin that he had seen the judge in Nacogdoches before he joined the gang, Tobin replies, "Every man in the company claims to have encountered that sooty-souled rascal in some other place. It is of particular significance that when the judge joins the gang of 12 men, they become 13, in a dark parody of Jesus and the 12 apostles." Yet, after all this, the kid only asks him one question before the scene ends. What's he a judge of? And just as he's about to answer, Tobin sees the judge in the dark on the other side of their large campfire, and says, "Hush now, the man'll hear ye. He's ears like a fox." While McCarthy doesn't let on what the judge's name means at this moment, he does eventually reveal it in a dream of the kids. But before we hear that, let's take a moment to understand what the judge sounds like at this point in our analysis. All of these stories, these impossible fables, allude to historical depictions of the devil, as Mundik readily admits, but the devil doesn't exist in Gnostic theology. Instead, there is only the creator that has influence over the people of Earth. After all, if the God that made the Earth created everything, wouldn't he also be responsible for the devil too? Tobin himself is probably a reference to the Book of Tobit, an apocryphal text that is excluded from many modern versions of the Bible for its perceived irrelevance. Tobit, in the story, is blind, and is only healed after his son is helped by the angel Raphael, disguised as a person. Blindness, especially as a theme of incompetence, is a reoccurring theme in the followers of the judge. The judge is also seen leading another character, the fool, a mentally ill man incapable of taking care of himself. The judge readily adopts the man as a kind of pet and keeps him on a leash as he wanders the desert, hunting for the remnants of the Glanton gang after their dispersal. Another reference to the biblical God leading the Israelites through the desert after their exodus from Egypt. Along with this, the judge plays the fiddle and dances inhumanly well, another reference to the devil's famous historical Faustian bargains. The combination is clear. God and the devil are one and the same, and they have always been so. If the judge was just the devil, he would not be leading Tobin, he would not lead the fool, and he would not have references to the burning tree. If he was just the orthodox God, he would not be playing the fiddle, he would not have his Faustian bargains, he would not speak the way he does. In Gnostic thought, there are certain people, pneumatics, that have the ability to ascend despite the fallen god's efforts. These people are unlike the rest of mankind in that they also have the capacity to save others. If Gnosis, the knowledge of the true divine God, and the human ability to reach it, is passed on, then humans can be saved. They can outsmart the false god of the Old Testament and reach the true alien salvation that lies outside of his influence. This is reflected in how we name the key text of our understanding of the Gnostic philosophy, the Apocryphon of John, a gospel of Gnostic philosophy. Now, it's important to realize here that this text, which is often misconstrued as a depressing or even nihilistic text, is a gospel. The word gospel comes from this Greek word, euangelion, eu for good and gelion for message, It's the same root word for the much more similar evangelion, which also means the same thing, the good news. As the word translated out of Greek into Latin and into Old English, it became god, or good, and spell, or news. As Old English slid into Middle and Modern English, the vowels of many words shortened, transforming the god into God, and this was subsequently mistaken for the already extant word God. The point being that the Apocryphon of John has a hopeful overtone. It is a testament of the good news. It itself was meant to teach people how to find the divine spark again, how to realize the false God of the Old Testament for what he is, how to be saved, and its salvific value was a hopeful thing in Gnostic soteriology. But McCarthy's book doesn't end with salvation, does it? No, the demiurge will not be tricked so easily. The cosmology of the Gnostics sets up an oppositional relationship between man and their creator, and that opposing God has had centuries to prepare the perfect trap for Christians to fall into. The tools I mentioned before. Along with his own power, the demiurge has enlisted the help of other fallen beings, the archons. And this is what Dougherty and Mundik believe the judge to be. On this, Mundik cites the conversation the gang has with the judge over yet another fire in the desert. The archons must fight a constant battle to keep the sparks of the divine trapped in the manifest world, because if all spirits, or pneuma, were to attain gnosis and return to the alien god, the forces of darkness would be left with nothing over which to exercise their dominion. Judge Holden's desire for such dominion is made apparent by his peculiar habit of sketching pictures of flora, fauna, and historical artifacts in his notebooks, and then destroying the original objects. When questioned as to why he does this, the judge replies, "Whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth." The judge placed his hands on the ground. He looked at his inquisitor. "This is my claim," he said, "and yet everywhere upon it are pockets of autonomous life. Autonomous. In order for it to be mine, nothing must be permitted to occur upon it, save by my dispensation." This, though, is not quite as archonic as I think Mundik and Dougherty believe. To me, both the judge's name and the overriding theme of ownership allude much more to the demiurge himself. This last passage is, to me, referencing a dominion greater than that of a servant of the demiurge. Near the latter part of the story, as the boy lays asleep in the middle of the night, he has his dream about the judge. This other man he could never see in his entirety, but he seemed an artisan and a worker in metal. The judge enshadowed him where he crouched at his trade, but he was a cold forger who worked with hammer and die, perhaps under some indictment, and an exile from men's fires, hammering out like his own conjectural destiny, all through the night of his becoming, some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer, with his gravers and burins, who seeks favor with the judge, and he is at contriving from cold slag brute in the crucible a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. This Jungian dream finally answers the question Tobin provided. What is the judge a judge of? He is the judge of the forgery, the currency being made in front of him. He is the judge of the false world, the world that the archons hammer into man, and the facade that covers up his true origin and purpose. The word demiurge also comes from the Greek word demiurgos, meaning literally artisan or craftsman. And the fact that the dream includes a forger alludes to both the Gnostic god's name and the idea that this physical world of his is but a fabrication. The use of the term "enshadows" here is a striking depiction of just how much power the judge has. He looms above us as we read, and silently begs the question, Have we fallen to the facade? Have we forgotten that divine spark within us forever? Has the judge's forgery worked? Well, it certainly did for the Glanton gang. The temptation of war, of violence, plunged them so far away from their divine spark that salvation was nowhere in sight, and McCarthy knows that this is not a new story. Countless souls have been swallowed by the facade, have been dragged down by the chains of war, the currency of conflict that the demiurge has presented to us, the one that waited for us before we were born. But what of the pneumatics? Well, Mundic and Dougherty and McCarthy agree that often even they are not so lucky. At the end of the story, the kid, now called the man, the most divided character from the horrors of what the Glanton gang did, meets the judge once again. They are at a bar, and the judge tempts him with hopelessness, comparing the world that they inhabit to a stage, something that, to me, echoes Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which itself is titled after Shakespeare's Macbeth. Macbeth, the Compson family, the Glanton gang, and even us, are but actors, stagehands, following a script that we did not write, one we have no choice but to follow. And, in the end, the kid too. Even with his division, even after escaping the judge many times before, even though that spark of salvation shone above him through the stars of the meteor shower that blessed his birth, this time, the judge's trick works. The rain had stopped, and the air was cold. He stood in the yard. Stars were falling across the sky, myriad and random, speeding along brief vectors from their origins in night to their destinies in dust and nothingness. Within the hall, the fiddle squealed, and the dancers shuffled and stomped. In the street, men were calling for the little girl whose bear was dead, for she was lost. They went among the darkened lots with lanterns and torches, calling out to her. He went down the walkboard toward the Jakes. He stood outside listening to the voices fading away, and he looked again at the silent tracks of the stars, where they died over the darkened hills. Then he opened the rough board door of the Jakes and stepped in. The judge was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling and gathered him in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh, and shot the wooden bar latch home behind him. Blood Meridian is here as a new kind of testament, a testament to the world we have been trapped in, and the prevalence of the evil tools that have controlled us and will continue to control us for centuries. Like the Apocryphon, it portrays a vicious world made by a jealous and selfish God, but unlike it, it is not about a path to salvation. Instead, it is a horrid and stark rendition of just how powerful and convincing that facade is, how entirely enveloped we are in the sins of the flesh which is used as a tool to keep us from salvation. It is an anti-gospel, an American evangelion of the bad news. As literature flowed toward the evening redness in the West, it transformed from romantic to Gothic to brutalist, and along that long line of succession, along that bore without origin or terminus, literature continues to flow and change, and mean more and more. So no, the judge in all his white whale-esque form and Faustian speeches is not a symbol for the devil of our Blood Meridian. He is, instead, a rendition of its God, and that is far, far more terrifying.